Bad Religion is probably best explored as a series of trilogies with a few interruptions, the first of which is all on this CD. So the album is How Could Hell Be Any Worse, but it's also got the preceding self-titled EP on here. And there's the mealy-mouthed, amateurish sounds of a teenage punk band. There's already some bits to admire, but quite negligible. When you get onto the album, there's also the mealy-mouthed, amateurish sounds of a teenage punk band, but we're starting to see some of Bad Religion's strengths in the songs Speed and Anger. Really, what I come to Bad Religion for, their eloquence and melodies and harmonies, isn't yet intact on here. I understand it's a quite important and influential album. I guess you had to be there in 1982. I was nowhere near Southern California. But really, I can think of more accomplished works from the hardcore scene at the time. This is darker than any of their future work. I mean, it kind of looks it. And harsher and more within the tropes of the hardcore punk scene before Bad Religion went and found their own way. Maybe it's second-hand embarrassment a bit on this one because I was in a band as a teenager and I'm maybe hypersensitive to the imperfections of that. There was then the album Into the Unknown, which was amazingly a sharp turn into prog. If I tell you it's not yet been issued on CD, that might set your expectations quite low. But really, if you go into it knowing what to expect, it's reasonably rewarding. The strengths of Bad Religion I mentioned outside of Speed and Anger, that's melody, harmony, and eloquence, are now evident. It's not got many songs on it, and it's not the most accomplished sound overall, but get ready to dislike this video as I place Into the Unknown as the superior album to How Could Hell Be Any Worse. You know, just to listen to. This reissue also has the EP Back to the Known on it, which really starts to bring it together. It's more pop than Bad Religion ever were in the future, but it's via doing that they really started harmonizing the choruses. They were finding where punk can still fit in the mid-80s. There's one song that's just a Circle Jerk song, really. There's one retake of an established song, but the rest of them set us up for the actual Bad Religion sound. They broke up around this point and 2 years passed, which was ages in the 1980s. That could have been the end of Bad Religion and they'd be a punk rock footnote, but they brought it into focus for an absolutely revitalized band. Then the late 80s Comeback Trilogy. This is the sound of Bad Religion realizing they still had the energy to bother being a band, and it's very fresh on Suffer. This album particularly, although the others sound very similar, is very influential on later American punk music. Of the three, as the album cover suggests, this one's a bit more domestic and suburban in the small world of Southern California, and it's a barrage of career classics. They're not always the most discernible because this album is Bad Religion setting the blueprint that they'll later deviate from, but by doing that they've made it really consistent. It's an important album and you'll hear and feel that if you put it on. No Control both brings more of the same and gets a bit more philosophical and occasionally atonal. Of the two songwriters, Brett in particular is very willing to get experimental, and that has a pretty high success rate. Though I'm gonna have to call it an inferior listen in total, No Control has some of Bad Religion's best tracks. Then Against the Grain shows the band willing to get real weird with it, but also showing their aptitude developed over the 3 years of recording these albums. This pulls the blueprint in all kinds of great directions. These first three are quite similar in format, with a high number of very speedy, short songs on them. Bad Religion had proved that they could do that, and they needed to try something different for the next trilogy. I mean, not too different. Bad Religion might sound quite samey to a newcomer, and you can say that to some extent. There are tropes they reuse, like the pick slide, the rapid discharge beat, the oohs and ahs, and that riff that they first used in the track When. But once you're acclimatized to it, there's a lot to discover, and you can start telling the two songwriters apart. Greg writes like a scientist, like a documentarian, and Brett writes more like a novelist or a philosopher or a stoner. There can be overlap in their vibe, but if you ever need to tell them apart, just see if you can imagine the song being sung by Brett. He's got a more standard pop-punk sneer, and he'll write to his own voice, so it'll be more rhythmic. Musically, Brett has more ideas outside of the punk mold and can nail some out-there tracks, while Greg has a more consistent quality. He's a master of modulation. Nobody is as good at using the major and minor of the same chord in the same song. You can mainly attribute that to his keyboard playing, which rarely gets through onto a Bad Religion record, but if you find his demos. Generator was actually written and recorded at the same output pace as the last three, but it was released a bit later and is never seen as part of that trilogy. And I'm not going to object to that. I think there's an obvious creative separation. It's a bit closer to traditional rock music, but then again, Bad Religion always had been compared to the rest of the punk scene. I think punk can often have the discipline of metal, and that's just not how Bad Religion play their guitars or write their melodies. This one has a darker vibe again. It's kind of depressed and philosophical. I find this to be a bit of a tentpole album, some great tracks, but in total just not as good a listen. Recipe for Hate also has the tentpole syndrome, but more tentpoles. This one might be recognized because it's got the single American Jesus on it, and there's a few more that are equally brilliant. Considering their punk roots, Bad Religion's mastery of melody is remarkable. And a similar vibe continues onto their major label debut, Stranger Than Fiction. Though it doesn't quite hit the heights of the last two albums, this one is more consistent, and thus a rollicking listen. I think it's always worth noting Bad Religion's lyrical strengths. They are an overtly political band, and tracks that aren't directly about real-time politics can often be about natural sciences and philosophy, and those are things that inform politics too. They have a lot to express about the world, and they know the words to express it with. Compared to the average lyricist, they're far more likely to include 4- and 5-syllable words and things from the sciences, and I appreciate the inclusion from that. It's not been dumbed down to pop sensibilities, and thereby has a broad range of concepts to explore, and it's just rare to see that kind of word worked into a good lyric, outside of Bad Religion, where it's done in nearly every line. There's now a trilogy without Brett, who was one of the two primary songwriters. Considering that he wrote about 50% of Bad Religion's songs, you'd expect that to be a major impediment to their career. Honestly, not yet on the Grey Race at least. Greg's really pulled it out. And with Brett's replacement Brian Baker on guitar now, we now have awesome guitar solos to add to the rest of the compelling punk rock. I feel that Greg's eloquence is at its peak here, and the sound of the band by now is really satisfying. There's a smattering of filler, but it all goes by very quickly. You'll find him rhyming America with hysteria long before Green Day did. This is a great example of 90s punk, and it should be revered like Smash or Dookie. This trilogy is interrupted chronologically by a live album with quite a strange approach. They recorded it straight from the recording desk, so you don't hear the audience at all. So it's a very dry sound and may as well be the studio recordings, and it's just a slightly worse version of those. There are 3 original tracks on this. They're not that important. The most notable thing about this release are the absolutely patronizing liner notes. I don't really address live albums in this series, but this one's a bit of a throwaway. I think fans disparage this next one, and I think they're wrong. You might downvote when you see what I put this above, but I think it's naive to judge it by the standards of 80s hardcore punk. If you call this what this is, 90s alternative rock with a punky edge to it, then it's a very accomplished piece. I can't fault individual tracks on this. The guitar crunch to this is great, and if we call it more medium pace, that's still medium pace by Bad Religion standards. Some of the songs get a little repetitive, and I guess if you're used to to a band that wraps up its songs within 2 minutes. Anything that spreads out a bit more can disappoint. But still, let me advocate this album of 90s alternative pop-ish punk rock. Then the New America. I think fans in general would agree that this is their poorest release, maybe outside of Into the Unknown. But I don't know, it brings something new to the Bad Religion sound, specifically hope, positivity, and a bit of intimacy. I think that's maybe why it's addressed with a bit more shame from the fans and the band. But I don't find it upsetting at all. I think this is another good example of Bad Religion music, so it's more for me to enjoy. Not a great example, I'm not going to recommend this first to anybody. Probably get a version with bonus tracks, there's some of the better stuff, but nothing wrong with this as far as I can tell. I guess when I've tried to incorporate optimism and intimacy into my songs, they don't seem that representative, so maybe it's like that. Let's sweep through Graffin solo because I won't do another video for that. Legion is one of those albums where he played every instrument, and I hadn't touched it for maybe over a decade before coming to do this video. And coming back to it, I realized this is an impressive, solid work, and also I subconsciously stole a piano part. It's well worth your time. Cold as the Clay is about 50% trad folk song, that being American folk, and it follows that vibe in general. Of the three, I find this disposable. It's not the kinds of sounds I turn up for. Millport has this Indigo Girls vibe and sits a nice halfway between the prior two. Already 20 years since the first of the three, this one reflects on longevity and time. These are all very different from what gets onto Bad Religion releases, and it feels like the songs are a diary more than a performance. But they're refreshing dispatches, personal and melodic. Brett had a passable single and a psychedelic EP that the kindest thing I can do is respect the anonymousness of, don't bother. But as well as founding and running a so important record label, he's behind this amazing disc, Era EP. It's a very surprising little burst of glitchcore. Then the Ui's Reformation, The Return of Mr. Brett, starts with an amazing album, The Process of Belief. This demonstrates the strengths of Bad Religion throughout, and if you don't feel how amazing it is, I guess the whole band's not for you. They're really on top form for this one, and it's got a bit of a theme of religion. And yeah, obviously a lot of their career often does, but not entirely negative, it's philosophical. Some of the best parts of this you wouldn't necessarily recognize as a punk band at all. It is, again, epic alt-rock music. The follow-up is similar but louder and angrier. This was the George W. Bush era, and they had a lot to talk about from that. This is a honed sequel in many ways. It's honed darker and more pop accessible, like there's some radio rock on here, and I mean that as a compliment. It's even more political, and they don't forget to play around with styles. It's just not as consistent as that last one. New Maps applies the strengths of this heavy, angry and refined rebirth of Bad Religion to their old template of doing a lot of quick songs. With the Ui's loudness what sounds on this, it's particularly heavy, and that weight behind it delivers a really consistent album of excellent songwriting. I think Brett has disparaged this album a bit, and if he hasn't, I'll cut this out. I don't know what he's on about at all. This is thrilling. It hits hard, and the melodies and words are really smart and satisfying. This is easily my second favourite Bad Religion album, and I don't know if Process of Belief just got me at the right time, but I advocate this one to the same extent. This version I've got has an extra EP of acoustic songs, and they're alright. Their musicianship at this point was amazing. I mean, it hurtles onwards, but the drumming, the guitar solos, the bass work, awesome stuff. This is still, and maybe even more, true for the contemporary lineup. It's a real tight version of punk. They did that Decade series during lockdown and demonstrated their versatility, and they're just great live. Then a Tens trilogy. Descent is relatively mellow. I mean, it's still going to contain all of the band's calling cards, but it mixes it in with... It's a bit of a Springsteen vibe on this, and I find that very welcome. I think this one's seen as lukewarm, and I do think it mires into filler toward the end. But if you're hating on it because it has an acoustic guitar on it, the first track on Bad Religion's first album has an acoustic guitar on it. This band are great at what they do, and they couldn't have gone any further in the heaviness direction of the prior few albums. So this is a nice way to steer it. It's a bit more personal, a bit more sing-along radio rock anthems, but just quite good as an overall average, and I concede that that's a relatively low assessment of quality within the Bad Religion repertoire. True North is widely hailed as a return to the late 80s format of a Bad Religion album, a lot of fast songs. To which I say, didn't you hear New Maps? I guess it is less heavy, less intricate, it's got fewer things that are outside of the punk scope. But that doesn't mean it's conservative, it's still a thrill. It's a very satisfying listen, and in parts it can be quite funny. There's a punkish mischief to the sound of this. This might seem like the kind of joke I would make up, but in 2013 they also released the Christmas Songs EP, and I'm still not joking when I say that it's pretty good. I'm really averted to Christmas as an agreed cultural norm. I still don't know what's going on and why we put up with that music. But that's become a bit easier now I know the Bad Religion versions. They've taken 8 mostly familiar Christmas songs and played it in their signature style, full of guitar crunch, full of rapid drums, gorgeous harmonies, and it's delivered sincerely but with a sense of fun as well. Obviously it's inherent to this that it doesn't rank that well among the albums. There's one non-Christmassy track on here, it's just a 20-year-old mix of American Jesus. They could have dubbed it to be American Santa or something. Then quite a lot of time passed before that Trump-era album, Age of Unreason. I think this being the most recent album is holding me back from assessing it fairly. It's taken me quite a while to get used to the very clean sound of it. I think it's quite similar in its vibe to Descent, but with a bit more of a political edge. I just don't yet have much to say about this one, but I'll keep assessing it before I record the bit where I rank them and place it honestly. Okay, I've decided, and it's good. It's intense and focused. It's the kind of album you could adapt into a musical. For this trilogy, let's pause to acknowledge Greg Graffin's voice. It's easy to be distracted by the lyrics, but the voice itself really stands out among punk bands. Quite often a vocalist can be the punk band's worst asset, or at least musical. But Greg brings this masculine yet melodic style that I can't think of anyone particularly similar to. Wait, Michael Stipe, yeah? That works. He's been good since Suffer and great since The Grey Race, but even better in the modern days. And apparently I didn't record an ending. Bad Religion are obviously slowing down in album output, but they've got plenty of other careers between them, and they tour extensively. I hope there will be more material when they've got new things to say, and in this fucked up world there's definitely songs to write. They're one of my absolute favourite bands, as you can tell by a few videos I've made. Probably my favourite live band, and most of these albums are things you really should hear.